the most intense face-off between a fighter and a royal guard. The midday sun shone brightly over Buckingham Palace, casting a golden glow over the historic grounds. Tourists gathered, chatting excitedly as they took pictures of the changing of the guard. The sound of camera shutters clicked, mixed with the murmur of onlookers from different parts of the world. The atmosphere was lively, with people marveling at the grandeur of the palace and the unshakable stance of the guards who stood watch. Among them stood Ethan Walker, a seasoned martial artist with over 20 years of experience in various fighting styles. Dressed in a fitted training outfit, his presence was hard to ignore, broad-shouldered, confident, and carrying himself with the air of a warrior. He had competed in international tournaments, faced fierce opponents, and mastered techniques that required extreme discipline and focus. Yet, today, he sought a different kind of challenge. Ethan had spent decades mastering control, discipline, and the art of staying composed under pressure. Yet, today, he wanted to test someone else's composure, a British royal guard. He had heard the stories. The unwavering discipline, the unshakable stillness, the guards who wouldn't react no matter what. But as a martial artist, Ethan believed that everyone had a breaking point. And he was about to find out where that was. He made his way toward the towering, stoic guard, curiosity burning in his eyes. He took a deep breath, rolling his shoulders, mentally preparing for what he considered a test of will. A test of control against control. A small crowd began to form as they noticed his focused gaze on the guard. Some exchanged amused glances, sensing that something unusual was about to happen. As Ethan reached the guard's post, he stood still for a moment, studying the soldier's rigid form. The red uniform was immaculate, the tall bearskin hat sitting perfectly in place. The guard's hands rested precisely on the rifle, his posture straight as if carved from stone. Not even a flicker of movement. Ethan exhaled, stretching his arms and rolling his neck, warming up as if preparing for a match. The crowd's whispers grew louder, a mixture of excitement and curiosity spreading through the air. Some raised their phones, sensing that an interesting spectacle was about to unfold. Ethan squared his shoulders, took another breath, and stepped forward. He was ready to begin. Ethan started small. He paced in front of the guard, throwing exaggerated stretches, rolling his shoulders, and cracking his knuckles loudly. The guard didn't blink. The crowd took notice. Cameras turned toward the scene. Encouraged by the attention, Ethan raised the stakes. He launched into a series of sharp, calculated movements, karate strikes, elbow blocks, rapid footwork, each executed with precision. He stopped inches away from the guard's towering figure, expecting a reaction. But still, nothing. The guard stood like a statue, unfazed, unshaken. His gaze remained locked forward, ignoring the flurry of movement just inches from his face. His discipline was absolute. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some chuckled, others waited in anticipation. Ethan stepped even closer. He executed a series of quick jabs in the air, his fist slicing through the space just inches from the soldier's chest. The rapid succession of movements created a rush of air, but the guard's expression remained unreadable, his posture as firm as ever. Determined to elicit some reaction, Ethan transitioned into a spinning back kick, his foot stopping a mere fraction away from the guard's shoulder. The movement was flawless, executed with the control only years of training could produce. The audience gasped, their eyes darting between the two figures, one a fighter accustomed to movement, the other an embodiment of stillness. Yet, still, the royal guard remained motionless. Ethan smirked, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. He could hear the crowd murmuring behind him. Some were impressed by his skill, while others were fascinated by the guard's unshakable composure. "All right," Ethan muttered under his breath. "Let's see how deep this discipline goes." He took a step back and prepared himself for one final test. This time, he would attempt something no one could ignore, a full-force jumping roundhouse kick, stopping just inches from the guard's side. The moment was electric, the crowd holding their breath in anticipation. Ethan inhaled deeply, then launched himself into the air, his leg extending in a blur of motion. And then, nothing. The guard did not flinch, did not acknowledge the act, did not shift even slightly. The crowd exploded with applause and astonishment. Ethan, still balanced from his landing, could only stare in disbelief. The sheer level of mental and physical control he had just witnessed left him speechless. The challenge, it seemed, had been answered. Ethan took a deep breath, letting the moment sink in. He had spent his entire life honing his discipline, training his body and mind to remain in control. And yet, standing before him was a man whose sheer willpower had just surpassed even the most rigorous training he had undergone. He turned to the crowd, many of whom were still whispering in awe. Some tourists shook their heads in amazement, while others clapped lightly in recognition of the display they had just witnessed. Ethan stepped forward again, but this time, it wasn't a challenge. He stood before the guard, straightening his posture in an unspoken sign of respect. He steadied the soldier's face one final time, searching for any hint of acknowledgement. There was none, but that, Ethan realized, was the true testament to this man's strength. He let out a short chuckle and shook his head. Then, turning back to the audience, he raised his hands in surrender. "I've spent 20 years training to master my composure," he announced, his voice carrying over the murmurs of the tourists. "But this man, he just stands here, and he's already far beyond me." Laughter rippled through the crowd, followed by an eruption of applause. Ethan took a deep breath, then, with a respectful nod, he bowed to the guard, an acknowledgement from one disciplined warrior to another. And with that, he turned and walked away, a newfound lesson weighing heavily on his mind. Sometimes, true strength isn't about movement, it's about standing still. Ethan let out a short chuckle and shook his head. Then, turning back to the audience, he raised his hands in surrender. "I've spent 20 years training to master my composure," he announced, his voice carrying over the murmurs of the tourists. "But this man, he just stands here, and he's already far beyond me." The crowd chuckled, breaking into applause. Tourists who had watched the entire spectacle with bated breath now smiled, appreciating the silent power of the Royal Guard's discipline. A fellow martial artist in the crowd, recognizing Ethan's skill, stepped forward and clapped him on the back. "It's not often a fighter admits defeat to stillness," he said, nodding toward the guard. "But today, I think you learned something just as valuable as any technique." Ethan nodded. "Respect," he replied simply. As Ethan walked away, the weight of the lesson settled in his chest. He had traveled the world, fought in countless arenas, and stood against powerful opponents, But here, in front of Buckingham Palace, he had found something he had never encountered before, a warrior of absolute stillness. With one final glance at the guard, he bowed slightly in respect, knowing that this lesson would stay with him forever. The tourists, too, left with newfound admiration. A few whispered to one another, pointing at the guard, realizing that true power is not always about force or movement. It is about the strength to remain unmoved in the face of chaos. And the royal guard? He simply continued standing, unwavering as ever, just as he always had, and always would.